The morning light caught on the mirrored surface of Turturanova Technologies headquarters, a towering sculpture of glass and steel that seemed designed to remind anyone approaching of the power housed inside. The building rose above the city, like an unapologetic declaration of dominance, its sharp lines and gleaming facade reflecting a company that thrived on precision and perhaps intimidation. In the shadow of that skyscraper, Olivia Johnson stepped out of a modest silver sedan. The car was deliberate, chosen for anonymity, just as her tailored charcoal suit, pearl studs, and simple leather tote were chosen for understatement. Her shoes were polished, but not ostentatious. Her presence carried quiet authority, without the need for a single logo or label to shout it. At 45, Olivia had the unhurried grace of a woman who knew the weight she carried in every room she entered. She glanced up at the shimmering tower, her expression unreadable, before crossing the marble entryway. Her mission today was straightforward on paper: assess whether Turturanova deserved a $2 billion investment from Johnson Capital Partners. In reality, it was far from simple. She had read enough about Leonard Harrison, the company's founder and CEO, to know his reputation brilliant, aggressive, and prone to running his empire as though it were still the 1980s. Today would be less about the numbers, which she already understood in detail, and more about the man himself. Inside, the air was cool, perfumed with the faint, expensive scent of polished stone and climate control. A grand lobby stretched ahead, all open space and minimalist luxury. Behind a sleek reception desk, a young woman named Miranda looked up, with a ready customer service smile, one that faltered almost imperceptibly when she saw Olivia. Her eyes flickered down to Olivia's understated bag, then back up with a slightly puzzled lift of her brows. "I'm here for my 10 o'clock with Leonard Harrison," Olivia said, her tone calm, even. Miranda's smile tightened a fraction. "Are you with the administrative applicants? HR is on the 3rd floor." "No," Olivia replied evenly, not offering more than necessary. "I have an appointment with Mr. Harrison directly." Olivia Johnson. The receptionist's fingers hovered over the keyboard a moment too long before she began typing. "Oh, please. Wait in that area." She gestured not to the plush VIP lounge, where 2 white men in tailored suits were sipping coffee from porcelain cups, but to a smaller seating area near the wall, functional, unremarkable, almost deliberately separate. Olivia's gaze brushed over the VIP lounge for a moment, noting the hushed tone of conversation, the relaxed body language of the men inside, the way one of them laughed loudly without glancing toward her. She said nothing, choosing the offered seat without visible irritation. She'd learned long ago that composure could be its own weapon. For 45 minutes, she sat there, long enough to observe the flow of employees, mostly white, mostly male, moving through the lobby. Long enough to catch the quick, curious glances when someone noticed her, as though trying to place her role. The patterns were familiar. They always were. And Olivia, as always, was watching, storing each moment away like beads on a string, waiting for the right time to pull it taut. When an assistant finally appeared to collect her, there was no apology for the wait, no welcome beyond. A brisk, "This way, please." She was led not to the grand executive boardroom she knew existed on the top floor, but to a smaller, windowless meeting space. Somewhere in the tower above, Leonard Harrison was likely holding court with those he considered equals. Down here, he would meet the woman he thought was just another name on his schedule, just another minor player in his empire. He had no idea how wrong he was. Olivia's heels clicked softly against the polished, concrete floor as she followed the assistant down a narrow corridor, the kind used for meetings the company didn't care to impress. The walls were bare save for a few corporate posters extolling innovation and excellence, printed in the kind of bland fonts that said nothing and meant even less. When the assistant opened the door to the assigned meeting space, Olivia took in its dimensions immediately small, with no windows, a table that could seat 6 at most, and a faint chemical smell from overzealous cleaning. A single carafe of water sat in the center, flanked by plastic cups. It was a deliberate downgrade from the spaces reserved for valued guests, and Olivia knew it. Leonard Harrison was already there, hunched slightly over his phone. The billionaire CEO looked exactly as his public image suggested. Thick silver hair combed back, an immaculate navy suit, a tie knotted just so. His cufflinks gleamed, understated but undoubtedly expensive. Yet he didn't look up immediately, as if even the act of acknowledging her arrival was too much of a concession. "Ms. Johnson," the assistant announced. Leonard finally glanced up, but only briefly, his eyes giving her the once-over in the way a jeweler might assess a stone they already suspected was flawed. "Have a seat," he said, waving a hand toward the chair opposite him, before returning his gaze to the glowing screen in his palm. 3 other men were already at the table, all white, all in variations of the same gray suit. One was thumbing through a printed agenda. Another leaned back in his chair, smirking faintly. The third tapped out something on a tablet, barely glancing in her direction. Olivia felt the air in the room, the unspoken hierarchy, the assumption that she was here to listen, to be guided, to take notes rather than lead the discussion. Leonard set his phone down at last and leaned back, folding his hands loosely. "So," he said, his tone light but edged with impatience, "I understand you're here about some diversity initiative?" He said the last 2 words with the kind of performative politeness one might reserve for an unavoidable dentist appointment. "I'm here to discuss potential investment opportunities," Olivia replied evenly. "Right?" Leonard said, with the faintest curve of a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Investment?" The way he said it carried the quiet disbelief of a man who thought he'd already figured her out. He tapped a remote, and a large screen behind him came to life with a slide that featured cartoonish icons and simplified buzzwords. "Let me walk you through what we do here at Terranova," he began, speaking with exaggerated slowness. "We're developing cutting-edge AI solutions for enterprise clients." He paused every few sentences as if giving her time to catch up, explaining basic concepts with the patience one might use for a child. "Are you following so far?" he asked after a shallow explanation of what an algorithm was. Behind him, one of the gray-suited executives leaned toward another, whispering something that drew a muffled chuckle. Olivia's eyes didn't waver from Leonard. "Your prospectus mentions a proprietary deep learning architecture," she said in a conversational tone. "Could you elaborate on how it differs from conventional transformer models, particularly in terms of inference latency at scale?" The chuckle died instantly. Leonard blinked, caught off guard, his gaze flicking toward the slides as if they might give him a lifeline. "Well," he began, "it's quite technical. Maybe my CTO could walk you through the complicated stuff later." "I'm also curious about your Q2 financials," Olivia continued, "specifically the 22% drop in reported R&D spending while claiming expanded research initiatives. How do those reconcile?" A thin line formed at the corner of his mouth, the closest thing to irritation he'd allowed to surface. He clicked forward quickly, bypassing the financial slides altogether. "I think those complex financial matters might be beyond the scope of our discussion today," he said smoothly. "Perhaps we should focus on more appropriate topics like how Terranova approaches diversity initiatives." The word appropriate hung in the air. Olivia recognized it for what it was, an attempt to box her into the corner he decided she belonged in. She made no move to correct him. "Not yet." Leonard signaled toward the door. "Melissa, could you bring in some coffee for Ms. Johnson?" he called out. Then, turning back to Olivia with a smile that wasn't a smile, he added, "How do you Take yours? Lots of cream and sugar, I bet. The implication landed in the room like a stone dropped into still water. Two of the men shifted uncomfortably. The third smirked without shame. Olivia's face was a mask of composure, but she felt the moment fix itself in her memory, like a pin in a map. She reached forward and closed her leather portfolio with a slow, deliberate motion, the sound soft, but unmistakable in the quiet. Her eyes met Leonard's without a flicker. "Before we continue," she said, her voice calm, almost conversational, "I'd like to see your diversity and inclusion statistics for executive positions." Leonard's jaw tightened, and for the first time since she entered, there was the faintest shadow of uncertainty in his expression. He didn't know it yet, but the ground beneath him had already begun to shift. The room smelled faintly of expensive coffee when the door opened again, but Olivia didn't move. Her gaze stayed fixed on Leonard Harrison, her posture the kind of stillness that made others uneasy. A young woman in a crisp uniform entered, with a tray of cups, setting them down with quick, careful movements. Leonard didn't thank her. Instead, he picked up his cup, leaned back in his chair, and looked at Olivia, as though deciding just how far he could push the line. "Why don't you tell us a little about yourself?" he said, his tone laced with the kind of false warmth that thinly veils condescension. "I'm sure everyone would be interested in hearing your journey." The pause before that last word was deliberate, as if her value in this room would be measured by the story he expected, a struggle-to-survive anecdote served for the entertainment of men who believed they had built their worlds without anyone else's help. Olivia didn't give him that. "I'm here to talk about market positioning, not personal history," she replied, keeping her voice level. She opened her portfolio, drew out a page of prepared questions, and began speaking about industry trends, about the gap she'd noted between Terranova's public statements and its actual financial behavior. Leonard interrupted with a chuckle that wasn't friendly. "We have plenty of analysts for that. What we'd like to hear is your perspective as a—" He left the sentence hanging, but his eyes completed it for him. "As a black woman. As a token guest in his kingdom." The door opened again, and the temperature in the room seemed to shift. A tall, broad-shouldered man in a dark suit stepped in, his salt and pepper hair immaculately styled. "Alan," Leonard greeted warmly, standing to shake his hand with both of his own, his face lighting up for the first time since Olivia had arrived. The exchange was full of familiarity, backslaps and quiet jokes about their last golf game. Leonard seemed to have forgotten Olivia entirely until he gestured vaguely in her direction. "Alan, this is Olivia. She's here to discuss our diversity initiatives. Not Ms. Johnson, not a potential investor. Just Olivia, and framed entirely through the lens of the thing he thought defined her reason for being here." Alan nodded politely, clearly already moving past her in his mind. Leonard turned back toward her, but now the friendliness was gone entirely, replaced with something almost performative. He clasped his hands behind his back, tilted his chin slightly, and said in a voice pitched for everyone to hear, "I don't shake hands with staff." The silence that followed was heavy. It pressed in at the edges, making the air feel colder. One of the executives coughed quietly. Another stared fixedly at his tablet. A third let the corners of his mouth twitch upward, quickly disguising it as a smirk into his coffee cup. Olivia didn't flinch. The years had taught her that showing shock or hurt only fed men like Leonard. Instead, she withdrew her extended hand with slow precision, folding it neatly over the other in her lap. Her face remained an unreadable mask, but inside, she felt the click of a door locking into place. This was the moment she had been waiting for. "I'm not staff," she said, her voice quiet but clear enough to carry across the room. Leonard gave a short, dismissive laugh, as though she'd made a joke he didn't understand. "Of course," he said, already turning his attention back to Alan. But Olivia was still watching him. Every move, every word, every micro-expression committed to memory. She leaned back slightly in her chair, letting the conversation drift on without her. It was remarkable how easy it was for men like Leonard to reveal themselves without provocation. All you had to do was give them enough space and the illusion of control, and sooner or later, they would hang their own noose in front of everyone. The coffee grew cold on the table as Olivia sat in perfect stillness, the storm she was about to unleash, hidden behind a calm surface. Leonard thought the meeting was his stage. He didn't realize she was already pulling the curtains closed, one quiet inch at a time. When the laughter subsided and Leonard turned back toward her, she smiled faintly, the kind of smile that carried no warmth at all. In her mind, the decision was made. The $2 billion wasn't just in jeopardy, it was already gone. All that remained now was how much damage she would decide to leave in her wake. Asterisk, Olivia excused herself with the kind of calm that didn't invite questions, pushing back her chair without a sound. Leonard barely acknowledged her departure, already deep in another exchange with Alan about their next golf trip. The door closed behind her with a muted click, cutting off the low hum of male laughter. The hallway was quiet, lined with abstract art that probably cost more than some employees' annual salaries. Olivia walked at an unhurried pace, her heels tapping rhythmically against the polished floor, a metronome for the thoughts crystallizing in her mind. In the sanctuary of the women's restroom, she locked herself into the last stall and sat not to hide, but to center herself. 3 slow breaths, measured and deep, smoothed the edges of her focus. She reached into her tote, pulling out her phone, her thumb gliding to a name already at the top of her contacts. David, she said when the familiar voice answered, her tone steady as steel under velvet. Initiate Phase 1. Subtle market signals only. No public moves yet. Her CFO didn't need an explanation. Already on standby. I'll have the team start the calls. Key analysts first? Yes, make it organic enough to stir curiosity, not panic. We'll let the ripples do their work. 2 streets away, in a nondescript SUV, parked between a coffee shop and a dry cleaner, a small strike team from Johnson Capital Partners stirred into action. Laptop lids lifted. Encrypted messages began to ping across secure lines. Well-placed whispers moved through the financial bloodstream. A quiet heads-up here, a raised eyebrow there. In the opaque ecosystem of market speculation, it didn't take much to plant the seed that something at Thought-provoking Technologies wasn't right. Back upstairs, the effect was immediate, but invisible to most. The first tremor appeared on an executive's phone, Thought-provoking stock, down by 0.7%. A blip easily dismissed. 10 minutes later, it was 1.3%. Screens lit up in the background of conversations. A few of the younger analysts shot each other quick, puzzled looks. By the time Olivia re-entered the meeting room, Leonard was mid-sentence about disrupting industry paradigms, his voice louder than necessary. One of the gray-suited men glanced at his smartwatch, his brows tightening for the briefest second before his face slid back into corporate neutrality. Is something wrong? Olivia asked, her tone all innocence as she returned to her seat. Nothing to concern yourself with, Leonard said, brushing it away with a flick of his hand. Just market noise. Happens all the time. Olivia smiled. Faintly, the way a chess player might when the first piece falls exactly where they intended. She reached for her water, the condensation cooling her fingertips, and began flipping through her notes again. Outwardly, she was the perfect picture of a diligent potential investor, politely engaged, here to listen. Inside, she was tracking the clock. Phase 1 wasn't about destroying Thought-provoking. It was about applying pressure, subtle and precise, enough to see how Leonard reacted when his perfect facade developed cracks. If he thought her silence meant passivity, He was about to learn otherwise. The meeting stumbled forward, but something intangible had shifted. The air felt tighter. More glances toward devices. More furrowed brows quickly smoothed into bland expressions. Olivia saw it all, cataloged it all. Every whispered aside was another stitch in the net she was weaving, one that would draw closed long before Leonard realized he'd been caught in it. And he would realize, just not in time to save himself. Leonard's office was everything the small meeting room was not: wide, sunlit, and designed to project authority. A floor-to-ceiling view of the skyline spread behind his desk, framed by curtains the color of deep wine. Shelves displayed awards, photographs with senators and celebrities, and glass cases containing sleek prototypes of Turturanova's flagship products. It was a room meant to impress visitors and remind them whose territory they had entered. Olivia stepped inside without comment, her heels sinking slightly into the thick Persian rug. Leonard moved around his desk, gesturing toward one of the leather chairs opposite him. "Let's talk one-on-one," he said, his voice softened, but still carrying that undercurrent of control. "I think we can clear up any misunderstandings from earlier." She sat, setting her leather portfolio on the arm of the chair, but didn't open it. Instead, she looked at him directly, her gaze steady enough to make most people fill the silence. Leonard shifted in his seat after a beat, then offered a thin smile. "You've seen a lot of companies, I'm sure," he began. "Sometimes first impressions can be misleading. I run a tight ship, but I value results, not appearances." "That's an interesting claim," Olivia replied, her voice calm. "Because today, in this building, I was kept waiting 45 minutes. I was directed to a side seating area, while others were escorted to your VIP lounge. I was given a child's explanation of basic concepts, repeatedly asked if I could follow along, interrupted when discussing financials, referred to only by my first name, told my value here was tied to a token perspective, and then, in front of your colleagues, explicitly refused a handshake with the statement that you don't shake hands with staff." Leonard opened his mouth, but she held up one hand, just enough to pause him without seeming abrupt. "And for clarity," she added, "Georgia is a one-party consent state. I recorded the entire interaction." The faint flush in his cheeks darkened. His jaw tightened. Before he could form a response, his phone buzzed on the desk. The display flashed urgent major shareholders. He ignored it, leaning forward instead. "I think you're taking some of those moments out of context." The phone buzzed again, then again. This time, the display read board chair. Leonard frowned and snatched it up, pressing it to his ear. "Yes?" His voice dropped to a hurried whisper. "What do you mean down 3%? There's no news, no announcement." "No," he stopped mid-sentence. Olivia knew without hearing the other side that her name had just entered the conversation. She watched the change happen in real time, the slight widening of his eyes, the way his fingers tapped against the desk. His gaze flicked to his computer monitor. He began typing, fast, pulling up a search window. The results populated almost instantly. Olivia Johnson, founder and CEO, Johnson Capital Partners, $50 billion in managed assets, known for pulling investment from companies with toxic corporate cultures. Headlines appeared. The Johnson Standard, accountability in corporate investment. How Olivia Johnson's withdrawals have toppled giants. His eyes froze on one line. Current target, Turturanova Technologies, pending final evaluation. Leonard set the phone down slowly, his face drained of color. "Ms. Johnson," he began, his tone now syrupy, where moments ago it had been sharp. "I believe there's been a terrible misunderstanding." "If I had known—" "There's no misunderstanding," Olivia said, standing. She was his height. Now maybe taller in her heels. You were perfectly clear about who you thought I was and how you believed that person should be treated. He moved quickly, stepping around the desk to block her path to the door. Please, he said, his voice low, almost pleading. Let's talk about this privately. I'm sure we can reach an arrangement that benefits us both. Through the glass wall of his office, employees were already starting to glance in. One or two phones were lifted, screens angled discreetly. The security guards near the elevator shifted their stance, uncertain. The time for that conversation, Olivia replied, her voice never rising, was when you thought I was nobody. She stepped around him with effortless grace, the movement of someone used to walking past men who had underestimated her. As she reached the door, his desk phone rang again, loud and insistent. On the lobby monitors below, Turtronova's stock price was flashing red, the drop accelerating past 7%. The whispers in the building were growing louder, carrying her name now, like a current moving through every corridor dot. By the time she left the office, Leonard Harrison's empire was already listing in the water. He just didn't know how deep the hole was yet, or how much further she intended to let him fall. Asterisk, asterisk. The elevator doors slid open to a view Leonard Harrison hadn't expected. Johnson Capital Partners headquarters was a world apart from Turtronova's gleaming intimidation. Here, there was elegance, yes, but it was understated, deliberate, without a single inch of space wasted on ego. Sunlight poured through high windows, washing over walls, adorned with contemporary pieces from underrepresented artists. The floors were warm oak, polished to a soft glow, and the air held the quiet energy of a place where work actually mattered. The receptionist looked up as Leonard and his attorney approached. Her smile was polite but cool, her tone professional to the point of formality. Good morning. Miss Johnson will see you shortly. Please wait over there. She gestured toward a seating area, stylish, comfortable, but positioned just far enough from her desk to be unmistakably deliberate. Leonard checked his watch. 9 a.m. sharp. They sat. Minutes passed. 10, 15. His attorney leaned toward him. Stay calm, he murmured. Leonard's jaw flexed as the seconds crawled. 20 minutes? 30? 45 exactly. The same wait time Olivia had endured at Turtronova before a tall, suited assistant appeared. Mr. Harrison, the man said, his voice clipped. Miss Johnson will see you now. Leonard rose quickly, buttoning his jacket as he followed the assistant down a long hallway. The doors to the conference room opened, and his forward momentum stalled. This wasn't the small, contained meeting space he'd imagined. This was a boardroom on a grand scale, a long glass table that could seat 20 city skyline visible in every direction. At the head sat Olivia Johnson, perfectly composed in a deep navy suit, her hair pulled back to reveal pearl earrings that caught the light each time she moved. But it wasn't just Olivia. Flanking her on either side were the full executive team of Johnson Capital Partners, Turtronova's own board chair, and 2 other directors, and most unnerving of all representatives from 3 other major investment firms Leonard recognized instantly. Together, they controlled hundreds of billions in capital. The power in this room was staggering, and it wasn't his, Mr. Harrison. Olivia said, not rising, her tone polite but cool. Please, have a seat. Leonard forced a smile, moving toward a chair opposite her. Miss Johnson, I'd like to start by expressing my sincere regret for any. This isn't about misunderstandings. Olivia interrupted gently, her voice cutting through his attempt at damage control like glass. This is about accountability. She opened a leather binder and slid it toward him. Leonard hesitated before flipping it open. Inside were transcripts time-stamped and annotated of his own words from the day before. There were also charts, internal emails, and testimonials from former Turtronova employees. each one detailing patterns of discrimination and exclusion. Leonard's attorney leaned in, whispering urgently, "How did she get these internal communications?" Olivia answered the question without being asked. Former employees bound by NDAs are legally permitted to share information during due diligence with a potential investor. Your legal department should have told you that. She gestured to the other firm representatives. For 6 months, Johnson Capital has been evaluating Terranova, not just financially, but culturally. Yesterday's visit was my final assessment. Of your leadership, you failed. Leonard's mouth went dry. This is reverse discrimination, he said quickly, his voice rising. You're targeting me because I'm a white male CEO. Olivia pressed a button on the remote. Leonard's own voice filled the room from hidden speakers. I don't shake hands with staff. Then came the chuckles, the tone he'd used to explain basic concepts, the cream and sugar remark. Each word was another nail in the coffin. Silence followed. Leonard could hear his own breathing. His attorney scribbled something on a legal pad and slid it toward him. Take the deal. Whatever it is. Leonard swallowed hard. What do you want? Olivia slid another document across the table. A complete restructuring of Terranova's executive leadership. Transparent pay scales. Blind resume reviews. A diversity and inclusion. Board with actual authority. And independent cultural audits tied to executive compensation. This isn't a negotiation. It's the only path forward if you want to avoid a total investor boycott. Leonard glanced toward Terranova's board. Chair, hoping for support, but the man's eyes were fixed on the paper in front of him. No one spoke for him. Not this time. As the terms sank in, Leonard felt the weight of the room pressing in, every pair of eyes on him. This wasn't just Olivia Johnson anymore. This was an alliance, a coalition of power that had quietly decided the future of his company. And for the first time in his career, Leonard Harrison realized he wasn't the one holding the pen. The first headline hit before Leonard even made it back to his office. Terranova faces investor revolt after leadership evaluation fails standards. Within minutes, the story was picked up by financial news outlets, the phrasing slightly different. Each time, but the implication identical. Powerful investors, plural, were withdrawing confidence in his leadership. The stock ticker began bleeding red almost instantly, the numbers scrolling downward like a slow-motion avalanche. Inside Terranova's headquarters, the atmosphere turned brittle. Analysts who had once strutted through the halls with easy confidence now spoke in hushed tones, eyes darting toward their screens. Meetings were interrupted by whispered updates. The marketing department's group chat exploded with unverified rumors, each more alarming than the last. By mid-afternoon, the board called an emergency meeting. Leonard arrived expecting to assert control, but the sight that greeted him was not one of loyalty. The directors sat in grim silence, their body language stiff, their gazes cold. At the head of the table, the board chair wasted no time. Leonard, the vote is unanimous. Effective immediately, you are removed as CEO. He laughed once, a short, sharp sound meant to signal disbelief, but no one joined him. You can't do this, he said, the words falling flat even as he said them. It's already done, the chair replied. Patricia Winters will serve as interim CEO. Our priority is stabilizing the company and meeting the conditions required by Johnson Capital and its partners. Patricia, a reserved but razor-sharp CFO who had endured years under Leonard's leadership, met his gaze with a steady calm. We're going to rebuild, Leonard, and we'll do it without the weight of your reputation dragging us under. The press release went live an hour later. Terranova announces leadership change, commits to cultural overhaul. It was scrubbed clean of any direct accusations, but the subtext was unmistakable. The market reacted with a jolt still down. But with a flicker of hope, Leonard's phone didn't stop ringing, but the voices on the other end were no longer allies. Investors wanted answers, former partners wanted distance, and journalists wanted sound bites. His PR team tried to spin the narrative as a misunderstanding, but screenshots of internal emails began leaking to social media. Anonymous employee. Accounts told stories of years of microaggressions, career roadblocks, and outright prejudice. The hashtag TERTER ANOVA toxic started trending, gaining momentum with every hour. By evening, a news drone hovered outside his gated estate, the glow of its camera light following him from room to room. His attorney advised him to keep quiet. "The less you say, the better," the man said, though his voice carried the tone of someone already half out the door. Across town, Olivia watched the unraveling from her penthouse office. Her team projected live market data onto a wall-sized screen, red lines dipping, headlines scrolling, social media feeds updating in real time. She stood with her arms folded, her face betraying no glee, only the cool satisfaction of a plan executed precisely. "We're not here to destroy them," she reminded her team. "We're here to ensure they can't keep operating the way they did. This is the shock they need to evolve." The next morning brought the kind of public reckoning Leonard had always believed himself immune to. Bloomberg ran a feature titled "Pattern of Prejudice: Inside Terranova's Culture Under Harrison." The article detailed settlements, NDAs, and complaints stretching back decades. Former executives spoke, some on the record, others under condition of anonymity, about how Leonard had deliberately cultivated an exclusionary environment while masking it with token hires and surface-level diversity programs. As the news cycle devoured him, Leonard attempted one last act of defiance. A press conference from the marble steps of a downtown law office. Cameras swiveled toward him as he stepped up to the podium in a perfectly tailored suit, chin high. "I am the victim of a coordinated attack," he declared. "This is the result of woke investors forcing ideology to business decisions." The moment might have gained traction if Olivia hadn't timed her counterpunch to land while he was still speaking. At that exact moment, Johnson Capital released a public statement. "We invest only in companies whose leadership reflects our values of merit, transparency, and inclusion. When these values are absent, so is our capital." Attached to the statement were anonymized excerpts from the cultural audit emails, pay gap statistics, promotion charts that spoke louder than any accusation. The live broadcast of Leonard's press conference cut away mid-sentence to a split screen of the statement. Reporters shouted questions about the damning figures. The confident posture Leonard had maintained began to collapse in real time, his voice stumbling, his hands tightening on the podium. That night, television news played the footage on loop. Headlines were no longer about Terranova. They were about him. Somewhere between midnight and dawn, Leonard Harrison went from being a feared billionaire CEO to a cautionary tale. And Olivia Johnson, without raising her voice or breaking her composure, had become the name whispered in other boardrooms, not as a threat, but as a test of who would adapt and who would be next. The game was over. But Olivia's work, she knew, had only just begun. Asterisk, asterisk. The Grand Hyatt ballroom shimmered under a canopy of crystal chandeliers, their light reflecting off a sea of dark suits and evening gowns. This was the Financial Innovation Summit, the annual gathering of the most influential names in global investment. Here, power didn't announce itself with shouting, it flowed quietly, in the way people leaned in when certain figures spoke, in the subtle choreography of who approached whom first. Olivia Johnson sat at the center of the panel stage, framed by two figures whose presence alone told the story of what had happened over the last year. To her right, Patricia Winters, now the confirmed CEO of Terranova Technologies, and to her left, Michael Chun, the managing director of one of the three firms that had stood with Johnson Capital during Leonard Harrison's downfall. From the stage, Olivia could see the curiosity in the packed audience. They weren't just here for the official topic inclusive investment standards, the new market imperative. They were here to see the woman who had pulled $2 billion from under a billionaire's nose and, in doing so, shifted an entire industry's conversation about power, money, and culture. About the moderator, a polished journalist from the Financial Times, leaned into the microphone. A year ago, Terranova was in crisis. Today, it's outperforming the market by 12%. Ms. Johnson, did you expect this outcome when you withdrew potential investment? Olivia let the question settle before answering. This was never about punishing one company. She sighed, her voice measured, carrying easily through the hall. It was about challenging the assumption that discrimination comes without a price. Markets are very good at pricing tangible assets. They've been slower to value inclusive cultures, diverse thinking, and the innovation those bring. My job is to correct that imbalance. Patricia took over seamlessly. Initially, we saw these standards as an obligation to win back investor confidence. But what we've learned is that they're a competitive advantage. Our talent acquisition costs are down 22%. The quality of applicants has risen. Retention is up, especially among groups that were historically underrepresented. In leadership, our teams are faster, more creative, more profitable. Culture isn't a cost, it's a growth driver. As she spoke, a large screen behind them displayed adoption statistics. 12 major firms had fully implemented Johnson Capital's inclusive investment standards. 30 more were in the process. The audience scribbled notes, typed into tablets, whispered to seatmates. Even the most skeptical faces in the room were betraying the same thing. They were calculating the cost of ignoring this shift. The applause swelled when the panel ended, but Olivia didn't linger in the spotlight. She moved through the crowd with her characteristic unhurried grace, accepting handshakes and brief conversations, making careful mental notes of which CEOs met her eyes directly and which looked away. Later, in her office high above the city, she stood before a wall display of Johnson Capital's updated portfolio. Terranova was there now, prominently featured not because she'd relented, but because they had earned their place through genuine transformation. Under Patricia's leadership, the toxic rot had been cut away. Marcus Phillips, once a powerless diversity officer, now had real authority as chief people officer, implementing transparent promotion frameworks that were already being studied as best practices across the industry. And yet, what satisfied Olivia most wasn't the headlines or the market wins. It was the quiet victories, the ones that didn't make news. Engineers whose ideas were credited to them the first time they spoke. Women leading major projects without having to prove themselves twice over. People who, for the first time in their careers, walked into the office without bracing for the 1,000 small cuts of bias. At 4 o'clock sharp, her assistant knocked. "Your mentoring group is here." Olivia turned from the window and walked to the conference space where 6 young women of color, all newly minted analysts from various firms, waited. She greeted each one by name, motioning them toward the informal seating area she used for these sessions. The conversation roamed from market forecasts to workplace strategies until one of them asked the question Olivia knew would come. "How did you keep your composure in that meeting with Harrison? I would have lost it after the first insult." Olivia smiled faintly, leaning forward. "Because I wasn't there to win an argument," she said. "I was there to change an outcome. Every slight, every dismissal, every assumption, they were data points. Proof of exactly what needed to change. If I'd reacted in the moment, I'd have made it about me. I needed to make it about the system." When the session ended, she walked them past the etched mission statement on Johnson Capital's glass wall. Capital is power. Power requires responsibility. The words glinted in the afternoon light, as if carved not just into the glass, but into the future she was building. Across town, Leonard Harrison sat alone in a hotel lobby, nursing a drink he wasn't really drinking. His latest venture had collapsed before it even launched. The disclosure requirements that Olivia's coalition had pushed into the market had made him untouchable to serious investors. The television over the bar played a segment on the Johnson Standard, highlighting how companies adopting the model were outperforming their competitors. He didn't look up. He didn't have to. He knew whose name they were about to say. And in penthouse office with a view of the city lights, Olivia Johnson was already thinking about the next boardroom, the next handshake, and the next table she would make sure was built to seat everyone who deserved to be there.